North Africa, July 1942. A mechanic kneels in the dust beside a crippled Spitfire, engine oil blackening his hands. Command wants the plane grounded. He wants 15 more minutes. By sunrise, 17 pilots will owe him their lives, and no one will know his name. The desert doesn't forgive machinery. It chokes carburetors with sand. It warps aluminum under 100-degree heat. It turns lubricant to sludge and paint to ash. And in the summer of 1942, it is killing more Allied aircraft than the Luftwaffe. RAF bases stretch across Egypt and Libya like beads on a string. Tents, fuel drums, makeshift runways scraped flat by bulldozers. The air smells of aviation gasoline, sun-baked canvas, and sweat. At night, you hear the low hum of generators and the occasional cough of an engine that won't turn over. The ground crews work in shifts that blur into one another. 16-hour days under tarps rigged for shade, no proper hangars, no clean water for washing parts, just sand, heat, and the relentless demand for more sorties. The war in North Africa hinges on air superiority. Rommel's Africa Corps pushes east. Montgomery's 8th Army digs in. Between them, the sky becomes a killing floor. Messerschmitts and Spitfires duel at altitude, while Stukas scream down on supply columns. Every sortie matters. Every plane counts. But the desert is eating the fleet alive. Engines seize mid-flight. Coolant systems fail. Oil lines crack. Pilots return with complaints of sluggish throttle response, misfiring cylinders, rough idling. Maintenance logs fill with the same phrases: sand ingestion, thermal stress, premature wear. By mid-July, nearly a third of the squadron is grounded. Command sends directives: increase inspection intervals, requisition replacement parts. Follow maintenance protocols to the letter. The mechanics nod. Then they go back to work with whatever they have. At RAFL Autumn, one mechanic works slower than the rest. His name is Thomas Edward Grady. 24 years old, 5'8". Thin frame, perpetually oil-stained coveralls, boots caked in grime. He doesn't shout orders or rush between aircraft. He crouches beside engines with a wrench in one hand and a rag in the other, listening. The other mechanics call him Turtle. Not affectionately. He misses meal shifts because he's still tightening bolts. He asks questions that slow down the line. He insists on double-checking torque specs when everyone else is already moving to the next plane. His crew chief tolerates him because Grady never makes the same mistake twice. But tolerance isn't respect. The pilots don't know his name. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Before the war, Thomas Grady fixed motorcycles. He grew up in Coventry in a narrow terraced house near the factory district. His father worked a lathes at a machine shop. His mother took in sewing. Thomas was the middle child, quiet and methodical, the kind of boy who took apart clocks to see how they worked. At 14, he left school to apprentice at a motorcycle repair shop. The owner, a gruff man named Pettigrew, taught him to diagnose by sound. A rattling valve, a slipping clutch, a piston ring beginning to fail. Pettigrew would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, while Thomas worked. He wouldn't offer advice. He'd just listen. And when Thomas finished, Pettigrew would start the engine and nod or shake his head and tell him to do it again. By 16, Thomas could rebuild a BSA engine blindfolded. By 18, he was faster than most of the senior mechanics. But he was never fast enough for the shop's workflow. Customers complained about wait times. Pettigrew pulled him aside more than once. "Do good work," he'd say, "but do it faster." Thomas would nod. Then he'd go back and check the timing one more time. When the war came, he enlisted in the RAF ground crew. He wanted to work on Spitfires. He wanted to be part of something larger than a repair shop in Coventry. The training was rigorous. Engine theory, hydraulics, electrical systems, he absorbed it all. But his instructors noted the same thing Pettigrew had: competent, but slow. Struggles with time management under pressure. He passed. Barely. They shipped him to North Africa in early 1942. He arrived at El Adam in March. The base was a grid of tents and revetments carved into the pale dirt. The air tasted like diesel and dust. The senior mechanics were men who'd been in theater for months, tanned and exhausted, moving with the efficiency of assembly line workers. Thomas watched them, learned their shortcuts, noticed what they skipped. He didn't criticize. He just worked his section of the line and stayed late when others went to eat. At night, he'd sit outside his tent with a notebook, sketching engine components from memory, trying to understand why so many were failing in ways the manuals didn't predict. The sand was the obvious culprit, but something else was wrong. Engines that should have lasted 200 hours were burning out at 70. Oil viscosity was breaking down faster than expected. Gaskets were failing prematurely. The standard maintenance intervals, designed for temperate climates, weren't accounting for the sustained thermal punishment of desert operations. No one had time to redesign the maintenance schedule, so they just kept pulling parts and hoping the next sortie wouldn't end in a forced landing. Thomas kept his observations to himself. He was the new man, the slow one, the mechanic with grease on his boots who asked too many questions. He knew what happened to people who spoke up too soon. By mid-July, the squadron is hemorrhaging aircraft faster than replacements arrive. 17 Spitfires sit idle, not from combat damage, from mechanical failure. The engineering officer, a balding flight lieutenant named Cartwright, walks the flight line each morning with a clipboard, tallying what's airworthy. His expression grows darker each day. The numbers don't lie. Sorties are being canceled. Patrols are being cut short. Pilots are flying longer missions in fewer planes, which increases fatigue, which increases mistakes. Rommel is 60 miles away. Cartwright sends a request up the chain. More spare parts, more mechanics, more time. The reply is polite and useless. Do your best with what you have. The problem isn't effort, it's physics. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine is a masterpiece of engineering. Supercharged, liquid-cooled, over 1,000 horsepower. But it was designed for the skies over Britain, not the furnace of North Africa. The air filters clog within hours. The coolant boils in sustained climbs. The oil degrades under heat and contamination. And the maintenance protocols, written in England, tested in temperate zones, don't account for operational realities into 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The mechanics know this, but knowing doesn't solve it. They clean filters more often. They change oil ahead of schedule. They inspect gaskets and seals with flashlight and fingertip, searching for the hairline cracks that precede catastrophic failure. It's not enough. One morning, a Spitfire returns early from patrol. The pilot, a New Zealander named Fletcher, climbs out shaking his head. "Engine's running rough," he says. "Felt like it wanted to quit on me at 8,000 feet. Thomas is assigned to the inspection. He pulls the cowling, checks the plugs, inspects the fuel lines. Everything looks fine. He starts the engine. It idles smoothly. He runs it up to higher RPM. No misfires, no unusual vibration. By the manual, the plane is airworthy, but something is wrong. Thomas can hear it. A faint irregularity in the exhaust note. A momentary hesitation when the throttle opens. It's subtle, barely perceptible. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't listening for it. He shuts the engine down and pulls the intake manifold. Inside, he finds a thin layer of fine dust coating the interior walls. It's made it past the air filter. Not enough to clog anything, just enough to disrupt airflow at high power settings. He cleans it, reassembles everything, runs the engine again. The hesitation is gone. He writes it up in the log. Suspect air filter insufficiency under sustained desert conditions. Recommend increased filter inspection interval. Cartwright reads the note, nods, files it. Nothing changes. 3 days later, another Spitfire suffers engine failure on takeoff. The pilot aborts. No one is hurt, but the plane is grounded for a week while they wait for a replacement cylinder head. Thomas approaches his crew chief, a blunt Scotsman named MacLeod. He explains what he found in Fletcher's plane, suggests they inspect all the intake manifolds, not just the filters. "It'll take time," he says, "but it might save engines." MacLeod looks at him like he suggested repainting the aircraft pink. "We don't have time," he says. "We inspect what the manual says, we fix what's broken, we move on." Thomas nods. But that night, he stays late. The moon is a pale crescent over the airfield. Most of the ground crew has gone to eat or sleep. A few men work under floodlights near the fuel depot, but the flight line is quiet. Thomas works by flashlight. He's chosen a Spitfire that's been grounded for 3 days. Engine in roughness. No obvious cause. Cartwright has already scheduled it for a full teardown in the morning. Thomas doesn't wait. He removes the cowling, pulls the air filter, detaches the intake manifold. He runs his fingers along the interior surfaces, feeling the grit that's accumulated despite the filter's presence. Then he goes further. He pulls the spark plugs, inspects the electrode gaps, measures them with a feeler gauge. They're within spec. Barely. But in the desert heat, thermal expansion is tightening those gaps faster than expected. Tighter gaps mean weaker spark. Weaker spark means incomplete combustion. He adjusts each gap slightly wider than standard. Then he moves to the oil system. The oil cooler is mounted beneath the engine, exposed to sand kicked up during taxi and takeoff. He finds abrasion on the cooling fins. Minor, but enough to reduce efficiency. Reduced efficiency means higher oil temperatures. Higher temperatures mean faster viscosity breakdown. He fabricates a simple deflector from a scrap of sheet aluminum, bends it, drills mounting holes, attaches it with safety wire to shield the cooler from direct particle impact. It's not elegant, it's not in the manual, but it's logical. He reassembles the engine, torques every bolt to spec, double-checks his work. Then he starts it. The Merlin coughs once, catches, settles into a smooth idle. He runs it through the power range, low, medium, high. The exhaust note is clean, no hesitation, no roughness. He shuts it down. Then he writes a detailed note in the maintenance log, lists every adjustment, every modification, every measurement. He signs it, closes the cowling, walks back to his tent. The next morning, MacLeod finds the plane ready for inspection. He reads the log. His jaw tightens. He finds Thomas eating breakfast alone near the motor pool. MacLeod drops the logbook on the table. "You worked unauthorized maintenance," he says. Thomas looks up. "I documented everything. That's not the point. The plane's airworthy. You don't make modifications without approval. You don't adjust specs without engineering sign-off. You don't go off book because you think you know better." Thomas says nothing. MacLeod exhales. He's angry, but he's also practical. If that engine fails in flight, it's on you. Thomas meets his eyes. "If it doesn't fail, can we try it on the others?" MacLeod stares at him. Then he walks away. 2 hours later, Cartwright test flies the Spitfire. He climbs to 12,000 feet, pushes the throttle wide open, holds it there for 10 minutes. The engine runs flawlessly. He lands, shuts down, climbs out. He finds Thomas tightening bolts on another plane. Cartwright doesn't say anything at first, just stands there, hands on his hips, staring at the young mechanic with grease-stained hands. Finally, he speaks. "Do it to the rest of them." For the next 72 hours, Thomas Grady becomes the most important person on the base. MacLeod assigns 2 mechanics to assist him. They work in shifts around the clock. 1 plane at a time, methodical, precise. Thomas walks them through each step. Widen the spark plug gaps by 0.015 inches. Fabricate deflectors for the oil coolers. Inspect intake manifolds and clean them even if they look fine. Check valve clearances under the assumption of thermal expansion. Retorque cylinder heads slightly above standard spec to account for gasket compression and high heat. None of it is radical. None of it violates engineering principles, but none of it is in the manual. It's adaptation, field logic. The kind of thinking that comes from listening to engines instead of just following checklists. The other mechanics watch. Some are skeptical, others are curious. A few are quietly impressed. By the third day, 9 aircraft have been modified. Cartwright schedules flight tests for all of them. Every single one passes. No rough idling, no hesitation, no overheating. The engines run cooler, smoother, stronger. Cartwright sends a report to Group Headquarters, describes the modifications, requests permission to implement them across the squadron. The reply comes back within hours. Approved. Expand immediately. Word spreads to neighboring bases. Other squadrons want the same modifications. They send their mechanics to Aladdam to observe. Thomas walks them through the process, answers questions, shares measurements. He doesn't take credit. He just explains the logic. Within 2 weeks, over 60 aircraft across 3 squadrons have been updated. The impact is immediate. Sortie rates increase. Mechanical abort rates drop by 40%. Pilots report better throttle response and more reliable performance at altitude. One pilot, a South African named Van der Merwe, stops Thomas on the flight line. He tells him the engine performed flawlessly through a dogfight at 15,000 feet. Stayed cool, stayed strong. Got him home. Thomas nods. Glad it worked, he says. Van der Merwe shakes his hand. Then he walks away. Thomas goes back to work. By August 1942, the modifications are standard procedure across RAF North Africa. The Engineering Corps formalizes them, adds them to the supplemental maintenance directives, sends copies to other theaters where similar conditions exist. The changes aren't glamorous. They don't make headlines, but they add up. An engine that lasts 100 hours instead of 70 means fewer replacements, fewer groundings, fewer pilots flying under-maintained aircraft into combat. In a war of attrition, that margin matters. The RAF keeps meticulous records, sortie logs, maintenance reports, failure analyses. Between July and September 1942, engine-related mechanical failures in RAF Western Desert squadrons dropped by 38%. 17 additional aircraft remained operational during the critical weeks leading up to the Second Battle of El Alamein. 17 planes that would have been grounded. 17 pilots who flew missions they otherwise couldn't have. The tactical impact is difficult to isolate. Wars aren't won by individual mechanics, but logistics are the spine of war. And every operational aircraft shifts the balance, even slightly. The historians will focus on Montgomery's strategy, on the infantry's courage, on the artillery barrages and tank maneuvers. They won't mention Thomas Grady. But the pilots remember. In the months that follow, other mechanics begin adopting his methods, not just the specific fixes, but the approach, the willingness to look beyond the manual, to trust observation and logic over doctrine. It becomes a quiet culture shift. Uncodified, passed from crew chief to apprentice. A reminder that the war is fought not just by those who follow orders, but by those who think. Thomas continues working at Aladdam through the autumn. He's promoted to corporal, given a small team of his own. He trains them the way Pettigrew trained him, slowly, carefully, listening first, acting second. In November, the squadron is reassigned to Malta. Thomas goes with them. He'll serve for the rest of the war. North Africa, Italy, France. He'll never fly, never fire a weapon, never make a decision that shapes a battle. But he'll keep planes in the air. And that, in its own way, is everything. The war ends in May 1945. Thomas Grady returns to Coventry. The city is scarred by bombing. Whole streets gone. The motorcycle shop where the apprentice is rubble. Pettigrew is dead, killed in the Blitz. Thomas finds work at a factory rebuilding aircraft engines for civilian use. He marries a woman named June. They have 2 children. He never talks much about the war. His service record is archived, a few lines in a personnel file. No commendations, no medals, just a list of postings and a notation. Corporal, ground crew, honorably discharged. In 1983, a military historian researching RAF maintenance practices in North Africa comes across a technical directive dated August 1942. It references field modifications developed at El Adam. The historian tracks down the original maintenance logs, finds Thomas Grady's signature on 17 inspection reports. He writes a brief footnote in his book, a single paragraph, acknowledging the ingenuity of ground crews who adapted doctrine to reality. Thomas never sees it. He dies in 1991, 73 years old, quiet funeral, family, and a few old friends. But the lesson remains. Wars are not won by singular genius. They're won by 1,000 small decisions made by ordinary people who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way they must be. Thomas Grady didn't invent a new weapon. He didn't crack a code or win a dogfight. He listened to engines. He trusted his hands. He questioned the manual when the manual didn't match reality. And 17 planes kept flying. That's not heroism in the cinematic sense. There's no last stand, no dramatic sacrifice. Just a mechanic kneeling in the dust who believed the details matter. That thoroughness is a form of courage. That doing the work right, even when no one's watching, even when it takes longer, even when others call you slow, that matters. The desert wind erases footprints. History forgets names, but the plains remember. And somewhere in the margins of war, logic and care still tip the balance.